Hey everyone, Ryan here, and welcome back to our Head and Neck Anatomy series of videos. Now that we've introduced the different bones of the skull, let's talk about foramina of those skull bones. A foramen is an opening that allows vital structures to pass from one part of the body to another, and in this case, between the inside and outside of the skull. And the word foramina is just plural for the word foramen. So let's go through each of the skull bones and talk about the foramina that each one has. So first, the frontal bone. This one has one, which is the supraorbital foramen, one on each side. The supraorbital foramen transmits the supraorbital nerve, artery, and vein, all sharing that same name, which is appropriate because it's located just above the orbit. The supraorbital nerve is part of V1, and that's the first division of cranial nerve 5, or the trigeminal nerve. And we'll talk much more about nerves and cranial nerves in future videos. If we go down to the maxilla, this one has the infraorbital foramen, transmitting the infraorbital nerve, artery, and vein, again all sharing that same name, which makes sense because this one's located just below the orbit. The infraorbital nerve is part of the second division of that trigeminal nerve. And you might be noticing a trend here. If we go one more bone down to the mandible, this one has the mental foramen, which transmits the mental nerve, artery, and vein, being part of the third division of the trigeminal nerve. So not only do we have that trend going on, but if we just look at the location of these foramina, they all fall in basically this straight vertical line through the pupil. So it's a very interesting location for these foramina, how they each cover a unique third of the face for sensory innervation. All right, let's go to the ethmoid bone, and now we're looking at a different view. We're actually looking at the base of the skull, half of the base of the skull, and this is an aerial view looking down at that base. So the ethmoid bone is up here, and it has this thing called the cribriform plate. And the cribriform plate has a bunch of tiny little holes in it where tendrils of cranial nerve 1 are transmitted through those little holes. Cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve, responsible for olfaction or smell. How I remember this is that I think of a baby's crib smelling pretty bad. And so if you remember that a baby's crib smells bad, that makes sense for the olfactory nerve responsible for smell. Let's move one bone back to the sphenoid bone. And like I said in the last video, this one has a ton of foramina, so we'll spend a bit of time on this one. So let's start with the optic canal. The optic canal transmits the optic nerve and the ophthalmic nerve. The actual opening is called the optic foramen. The actual tunnel is called the optic canal, which empties into the orbit. Of course, the optic nerve is responsible for our sight. Next, we have the superior orbital fissure, which is this pretty large opening, and it transmits a lot of nerves, being cranial nerve 3, 4, V1, and 6. So a lot is passing through that superior orbital fissure. If we go back to this hole here, this one's called the foramen rotundum, a nice round hole that transmits V2. If we go back to this one, this oval shaped hole, that's the foramen ovale. This one transmits V3 and the lesser petrosal nerve. This small little hole there is called foramen spinosum. This one transmits the middle meningeal artery. And then we finally have the foramen lacerum. This is this hole between the sphenoid, temporal, and occipital bones. This one transmits the greater petrosal nerve and deep petrosal nerve. Both combined together is called the Vidian nerve, or nerve of the pterygoid canal. That's both the greater and deep when they're combined. So how I remember the different V1, V2, and V3 holes that they're being transmitted through, I remember this little phrase, standing room only. Standing room only SRO, and that corresponds to S being superior orbital fissure for V1, rotundum for V2, and ovale for V3. SRO, standing room only. So let's go back to the temporal bone. This one has the carotid canal, which is located right here. This transmits the internal carotid artery. The internal carotid artery actually enters the bottom of the skull a bit more laterally, and then it courses medially through this petrous part of the temporal bone, where it exits right at this hole, right by that foramen lacerum at the base of the brain. We have the internal auditory meatus, which is right here on the other side of that mountain, the petrous portion of the temporal bone. This one transmits both cranial nerves 7 and 8. Then we have the jugular foramen, which transmits cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11. And finally, we have the occipital bone. The occipital bone is home to the hypoglossal canal, which transmits our very last cranial nerve, which is cranial nerve 12. And then, of course, we have this really large hole called the foramen magnum, which is an appropriate term, the great hole. And this one transmits the spinal cord, spinal, and vertebral arteries. Of course, the spinal cord taking up the bulk of that space. Alright, so that's it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to this channel for much more on dentistry. If you're interested in supporting this channel and what I do, please check out my Patreon page. Thank you to all of my patrons here for their support. You can unlock extras like access to my video slides to take notes on, and practice questions for the board exams. So go check that out. The link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.